Well, I echo her sentiment. I'm very impressed with this crowd, but of course, this is going to be a wonderful fireside chat, so happy to be here. I'm Hailey Lennon. I'm general counsel at Fold. I was previously a partner at a law firm and then in-house counsel at Coinbase in the early days. And we had a podcast about a year ago. And so I'm really excited for this fireside chat because so much has changed. So many new things are happening with the SEC, and I'm just really excited to sort of dive into that. So thanks so much for joining.
Hailey, it's great to be here and welcome everyone. It's great to see all of you guys. I do want to start with my disclaimer, of course, which is that my views are my own views as a commissioner, not necessarily those of the SEC or my fellow commissioners.
Awesome. So I think I kind of wanted to...
Wow, you guys are really nice if you're clapping for that.
So top of mind for myself, and I think a lot of people in the industry, is just the change in sort of the regulatory and enforcement climate of the SEC. Since the change of administration, the SEC has either settled or dismissed many of the enforcement actions that were pending against, companies like Coinbase, even XRP and led by Ripple. And so I guess what I'm curious about is what are the current enforcement priorities, if any, when it comes to the SEC and the digital asset space?
Yeah, I mean, I think some people have taken the fact that we've looked at a lot of these cases and said it doesn't make sense to move forward. They've said, okay, well, we can do whatever we want in this space, or in the name of crypto, we can engage in fraud, and that is certainly not the case. I think the goal is to use our enforcement tool for what it was intended to be used for, which is when there are clear rules and people violate them, then we can use our enforcement tool. But it's certainly not to say that there will not be enforcement. There's a lot of bad activity, as we all know, that's perpetrated in the name of crypto.
Yeah, I think it's a great opportunity for you all, your team, the crypto task force, to sort of reset about what the priorities are and just making sure that the bad actors are the ones being pursued. And there's just there's limited resources and this industry moves so quickly that I think it's a great time to just that you all are reprioritizing and sort of refocusing. But before I joined Fold, I would tell clients this does not mean that everything goes. It doesn't mean that all cryptocurrencies aren't securities. There's a lot to be kind of to digest and for you all to still, inform.
Yeah, and I mean, we're trying to work on this through the regulatory policy avenue, and we're trying to draw in as much help as we can from other people who have been thinking about these issues for a long time. And I think that's really the way to get to good rules. And one complaint that I had was that in an environment of regulatory uncertainty, it actually is much harder to identify the bad actors, and it ends up giving the bad actors sort of a more ability to do bad things, and it drives legitimate actors either outside of the US or into other industries because it's not worth it to them to try to even wade through that morass. And so I think that's what we're trying to do, is create a good environment for the legitimate actors and a bad environment for the bad actors.
That's great. You recently tweeted that cryptocurrency projects that are deemed a security may have disclosures that they are required to file. And also, I think you kind of hinted at you all trying to put out more clarity about when something is or is not a security. I just wondered if you could elaborate on that tweet at all, just about what those disclosures would look like, or what that guidance or clarity might be.
Yeah, so one of the things the SEC has been trying to do in the last 4 or so months is we've been trying to identify things that are not within our ambit as a securities regulator. And that's hard for some people to grapple with because they say, well, some bad activity might be going on in that area. But my response is, yeah, but Congress gave us a remit and we have to stay within that remit. So part of what we're doing is just identifying things that are outside of our remit. And then once something is in our remit, we're trying to provide some guidance. So the staff put out guidance on if a company is a public company, for example, and it is engaged in crypto in some way, here are some disclosures that you might want to think about. What we're hoping to get to is to provide some clarity around when something's a security or not security. We can do some of that, again, through guidance, and we hope to do some of that through longer-term rulemaking. And then, of course, we're working with Congress as they're working on legislation.
Yeah. It's interesting, we're at a Bitcoin conference, and the thing I always found a little ironic about the SEC's regulation of the space under Gary Gensler was Bitcoin was the only cryptocurrency he was willing to sort of explicitly say is a commodity. But there was still, with the enforcement actions, a lot of burden on the industry trying to evolve. And I just wonder if, as we're rethinking sort of the guidance, if you think, and maybe you can't speak to this yet, but if the line between Bitcoin and sort of altcoins as securities, like if there's going to be more cryptocurrencies that are acknowledged as a commodity.
Well, I have said we're trying to do a 180 from what we were doing before at the SEC, so I guess that means Bitcoin is now the only security. Just joking. It's a joke. That's a joke. Kidding. So no, I think what we're really acknowledging is that actually probably most crypto assets as we see them today are probably not themselves securities. That doesn't mean that you can't sell a token that's not itself a security in a transaction that is a securities transaction. And so that's where we really need to provide some guidance, is what transactions qualify as securities transactions. I think longer term, you're going to see more tokens that are in and of themselves securities, like you take a share of a stock and you tokenize it. Obviously, that's still a security. And so I think some of this will become clearer, but there is ambiguity around the transactions that we really need to clear up.
I think it's a process, especially with the change of administration. There's new people involved. There's the crypto task force that I'd love to touch on a little bit later. But yeah, it's a process of you all trying to put out that guidance in a way that doesn't add any more confusion than there already is. So I actually would love to touch on the crypto task force. So you've touched on a little bit of the priorities maybe that you're focused on, but that's a new organization that you lead. And I'd love to know if there's sort of a list of priorities or just how you all are thinking about what the role of that task force is.
Yeah, so I think what we're trying to do is, again, the task force is a group of people within the SEC. We brought in a few people from outside, but we drew a lot of people from within the SEC. And then we're working with staff across the SEC. And one thing that I think is probably encouraging for you all to hear is that the tone from the top really does matter. And so when we've said to staff, you actually can think about how the securities laws apply in this space and do it in a nuanced way, staff really jumped right in. And so we're trying to work with them to figure out areas where we need guidance. I put out a bunch of questions, around 50 questions, and we've gotten a lot of really good input in response to those. We're holding roundtables. We have our last one coming up on DeFi, actually coming up in a couple weeks. And so those efforts are really designed to feed into the process by which the staff and then the commission can think about guidance and rulemaking. And we're also coordinating work with Congress and other agencies across the administration.
I've always thought you've done a great job sort of inviting commentary or meetings from the industry. There's a lot of people who have been in the space a long time and have very strong opinions, but are also very well educated in this space or understand some of the nuances. So, I think as an industry, it's up to us to also be part of that. Under the former administration, I always said regulators should really collaborate more with the industries they're regulating. But on the other side, it's our responsibility as industry participants to, engage in those conversations or help inform if there's anything you all are looking for.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, Hailey, because the problem is that with all of the animosity that has been toward my agency, I think people have forgotten that people both within and outside government have forgotten that government really does work for the people. And so it's very important to have input of folks. And it isn't only, industry players in sense of firms who are engaged in this space, but really individuals who care about this for philosophical reasons as well. Because I think that's one, I've been in the government a long time now, but one thread that I think is so easy to get lost in these conversations what makes this country unique, right? What makes the United States unique is that we're all about people's freedom, freedom to innovate, freedom to live their lives the way they want. And that it is very important that whatever we do on the regulatory side embeds that philosophical underpinning. And so we need to hear from people. And those conversations can be difficult to have in Washington because we have accepted in the United States a much greater degree of financial surveillance than personally than I think is appropriate. And I think it's important, you all need to weigh in on that because as we all know, this technology, it has some advantages in terms of you can build privacy protecting things into it, but it also makes it easier. And so, AI does too, right? All this ability now to collect data and to analyze data, it becomes easier and easier for the government to just say, okay, well, we'll just collect all this data and we'll monitor what people are doing. But that turns us into the kind of place that we don't want to be. And so, again, there's a valid law enforcement function that the government has, but we have to figure out where to draw that line and how to get that balance right. And so your voices are so important in helping us think through those issues. And this is a moment when we can have that conversation again because we're thinking about how to apply some of these existing laws to a new technology. And so if we don't have the conversation now at the outset, 5-10 years from now, we're going to look back and say, why did we not take the steps we needed to protect ourselves?
It does feel like that time, and I was about to mention this idea of balance because what you said earlier really spoke to me. You don't want to penalize the good actors by unburdensome requirements. And I agree with you in terms of sometimes KYC or some of the surveillance measures could be tweaked in a way that they actually prevent bad actors rather than just become a honeypot of data. And so, yeah, I think it's just very refreshing to hear some of your thoughts on the industry. Another topic I just wanted to briefly touch on is, I think most people agree that, the Trump's election, the change of administration has been a very positive thing for the industry. I think of it as sort of a pendulum swing where we all felt a little like you didn't know what you could do and what you couldn't and what agencies were going to come after different companies. And then the pendulum swung a little too far, in my opinion, where, Trump launched Memecoins and some of the things. And it's, we're having, I would say, a little bit of an identity crisis in figuring out all the regulations. The SEC put out guidance about Memecoins, saying that, it's sort of a similar statement that not all meme coins are necessarily securities. Is it fair to say that sort of the guidance that what may come out eventually that does clarity on when something's a security would be able to apply to meme coins in the same way? Or do you think that there's an aspect of that that's more speculative or adds complexity?
Well, I mean, I think something like a meme coin, again, facts and circumstances always matter, but something like a meme coin is more like a collectible, right? And so does it even make sense to have the securities laws apply to something like that? I think most of us would probably say no. It's important for people who are buying those to understand they're not getting the protections of the securities laws. And so I think we will try to provide more of that kind of guidance. Again, fundamentally, this is about getting a clear set of rules. If Congress then decides we want to have the meme coin regulatory commission, I guess they could set that up. I don't know that we would think that's necessarily a great idea. But you can always fill a regulatory gap if you see it. I'm someone who looks at the world a little bit differently, and I say, look, if you're buying a meme coin and you're expecting to become a billionaire because you buy the meme coin, like buyer beware. You can become a billionaire one day and the next day you're back to zero again. So just go into it eyes wide open. I think if we set up a regulatory framework in which we say we have to make sure that nobody ever loses money on buying something that they're speculating on, I mean, no one's going to ever be able to buy anything. So I just think be an adult, right? If you want to engage in speculation, go for it. But if something goes wrong, don't come complaining to the government about it.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of, what you're saying, I completely agree with. And we're, inside a casino currently. And every time I walked to the conference, I'm like, these people are buyer beware. They're putting their money in the slot machine, pulling it, see what happens. So, obviously I have dedicated my career to Bitcoin because I do view it as a standalone asset that is, a long-term way of storing value and investing and not the speculativeness of it. So, but I agree with you. I mean, at the end of the day, you're tasked with helping with investor protection, but you are not tasked with ensuring that people don't make, people can make their own decisions about things.
Yeah, and I think that's why sometimes I find it funny because Bitcoin maxis sometimes tweet at me about altcoins and they're like, yeah, they're all securities and we want you to regulate them into the ground. And then I say, come on, the the ethos underlying Bitcoin is an ethos of freedom, of people making their own decisions about how they want to store value and how they want to transfer value from one to another. And so keep an open mind in terms of letting other people make decisions about what they want to do with their money, and don't look to government to try to get rid of altcoins, right? That isn't the freedom ethos we have. You might disagree with someone else's decisions, and that's great and that's fine, and you can have those conversations. But I think it's really important for us to maintain an environment in which people are free to make their own choices, even ones that I wouldn't agree with, that you wouldn't agree with, and then bear the consequences of those decisions and learn from that. And I think that's what has made, again, what's made this country what it is giving people the choice to live their own lives without having someone tell them, no, that's not smart for you to buy, or it's not good for you to be in the casino, right? I mean, that's people's choice.
So we have about 9 minutes, and another trend that I've been seeing. Obviously, I'm general counsel at Fold. We have about 1,480 or something Bitcoin on our balance sheet. We just recently were listed on NASDAQ. And there's this trend of companies starting to hold Bitcoin in their treasury, as sort of a long-term investment to help runway. I just wondered, your thoughts on sort of that trend. I don't, if you have any personal concerns, or if you think that that trend makes sense, given that we're, having countries discuss having a Bitcoin strategic reserve or stockpile. So I just would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an important moment for me to say, look, as a securities regulator, companies can do whatever they want. They can make their own decisions. They have to disclose that. That's my job, is to make sure that public companies like yours are disclosing to investors what they're doing so that the investors can make decisions about whether to invest in that company. But certainly it's not to tell companies what they can or can't hold on their balance sheet. So I'm agnostic.
Okay. Everyone likes what you're saying. So yeah, I mean, I think that the trend is going to continue, and I definitely see the value in that. For Fold, for example, like our product offering is Bitcoin products, so we're sort of aligned not only just for in our treasury, but we're aligning with our users and saying, what we sell, we actually believe in. So, I think it's an interesting trend, but I think we'll continue to see more of it. I think there's been new companies announcing it, announcing their, sort of ideas of getting into holding Bitcoin on their treasury. So, it's just an interesting sort of trend that I think we'll continue to see for a while. So I think with the final time we have, I'd love to talk a little bit about if you think that there needs to be sort of additional congressional action to help clarify any of the regulations in the space, or if you feel that the SEC and different regulatory agencies are in a position where you can kind of take it from here.
I mean, I think there's a lot that we can do with the existing authority that we have. Then there's the question of whether, as I said, and you talked about the Memecoin statement, there's some things that we're saying, this is not within our space. I do not think that most crypto assets are themselves securities. And so that means that platforms where those trade are not required, unless they're also trading securities, they would not be required to register with us or frankly anyone else at the federal level. And so that's a question for our society. Do you want to have a federal regulatory regime for crypto trading platforms where retail folks, okay, see, you got one answer right there. And I think, I think that it's a fair question to ask. And I always say to people, look, my view of the world is that people can make their own decisions. And when you see issues come up in the crypto industry, for example, you can do things. You don't have to wait for the government to come in with a solution. You can do things, right? You can say to the crypto trading platforms, we want transparency into what you're doing in those omnibus wallets. We can say to counterparties, we want to have a sense of what you're doing with our assets when we entrust them to you. We want to understand the leverage that's going on here, right? There are things that the industry can do itself, and I think moments like FTX were good moments for people involved in the industry to sit down and say, what can we do on our own? And a lot of people said instead, well, we want the government to fix this for us. Again, that's one option, but there are ways that you can do that without the government's involvement. That said, I think a lot of people do think that retail trading platforms should have a government regulator, and if that's what you think, then you need legislation for that, because there is no federal agency that's doing that right now. But it's a choice that we make.
Yeah, I think I think the situation with FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried was interesting because I think that the industry may not have had the same frustration with that sort of not being caught if these other exchanges weren't sort of the subject of litigation or enforcement actions, because it felt like a little bit like, what about you missed the big thing, and
so
obviously not blame.
Yeah, I think that point is a really good one, and it's kind of goes back to the theme we were talking about earlier, which is if you set up a framework in which you say, okay, if you're trying to do things the right way, we're going to sue you, but otherwise, if you're kind of staying under the radar, you're fine. That's a terrible framework to set up. So yeah, we need to have a better option. But I do think that sometimes when something bad happens in this space, people who are remarkably, sort of free thinkers, free minds, free markets, kind of libertarian-minded, little L libertarian-minded people, then they come in and they're like, well, where was the government? Why aren't you protecting me? Hey, crypto mom, where's my bailout fund? And I mean, come on, let's have some consistency. And so I think, that's all I'm calling for from you all is like consistency. Yes, you should have freedom to make your own choices. And when it goes wrong, pick yourself up, dust yourself off, learn from it, and do better next time. And that is the best way to move forward.
Yeah, I think, not sort of SEC focused, but all the bankruptcies showed a lot of gaps in sort of understanding of the industry. I was working at a law firm, and it's public information that we helped with BlockFi's unsecured creditors. And I can't tell you how many people were so confused about being an unsecured creditor, how their Bitcoin could just get liquidated and all of a sudden they get a dollar payout. So, as an industry, we really do have to be more informed, because that, you put yourself into a situation where all of a sudden you don't know your rights if it goes wrong, and you don't know how it's going to be sort of prioritized. So
I think that's a really important point. And it's not only the industry. If you're offering a service to someone, you need to be candid with them about what their rights are.
yeah.
And so a lot more transparency around that, and people should be demanding that. You see that in the TradFi world too. There are limits on deposit insurance, right? And then people have more money in the bank than is covered by deposit insurance. And when something happens to the bank, they're like, well, why am I not being protected? Well, I mean, again, you've got to know where you stand. And so we could do a lot better with transparency in crypto and outside of crypto.
I agree. I would challenge any companies out here to kind of take that back to the team and just think about it, because at the end of the day, it's funny because I think people outside of the Bitcoin space that don't understand Bitcoins, they're like, this is internet money, but people are entrusting real large sums of money to companies in this space. Yeah.
I think there's some work to be done on the legal side there as well. Just trying to understand how the existing laws apply in that space. And so that's some difficult legal work.
Well, we have 1 minute. I wanted to kind of leave off with a future thoughts. Looking 5 to 10 years into the future, I think the role of Bitcoin is going to become much more sort of just combined with the traditional financial world. I think for a while it was really sort of like Bitcoin and traditional finance, and now we're seeing, the end of Operation Choke Point 2.0 and the unbanking of the industry. We're seeing a lot of great things there, and for better or worse, depending on your views of Bitcoin, I think those worlds are melding. And so I just love to hear any thoughts you have on that, including if the SEC is sort of taking that into consideration as like, maybe 10 years ago, there was an argument like this is going to go away on its own. And now it's like, very much here to stay forever, I believe. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think when the Bitcoin exchange traded products came online, it was hard to say we can ignore this anymore, right? That is the real melding, and some people didn't like that. But I think when you create something that people are free to use or not to use, it is going to get incorporated into traditional financial products, and so we have to think about that. How does it interact with our regulatory framework? Ultimately, I would not ask a regulator to prognosticate what will happen in the future because we're not particularly good at imagining that. But I think the key is to keep the ability, make sure that whatever regulations we put in place, we preserve people's ability to make their own decisions about how they want to transfer value from one to another. And so that is a paramount consideration for me, that people have that freedom to make their own choice about where they put their value and how they transfer it.
Well, thank you. I've always found your takes to be so refreshing, and it's great to catch up with you.
Thank you, Hailey.
Yeah.
Thanks to all of you.